My name is Eleanor Jane Whitcomb, and I was 38 years old the night I stood in a country club ballroom in front of 90 guests and tore a $4 million deed in half. It was a Saturday in June. My adoptive father, Carl Whitcomb, had just turned 70, and he stood at the head table with a microphone in one hand and a champagne glass in the other, mid-toast, looking out over a room full of people he had spent his whole life trying to impress. He found me near the back, by the folding chair someone had set out for me at the edge of the room, away from the family table, the way it had been set out for me at every holiday for 30 years. He smiled the smile he used for clients. He lifted his glass another inch. "I'll tell you all something funny," he said into the microphone. "We updated the will last month, and the lawyer asked about Eleanor, and I had to stop and think about it." He laughed, and the room laughed with him, warm and easy, the laugh of people who've decided something is permitted. "No hard feelings, sweetheart. You were never really ours. We just never got around to crossing you off." 90 people laughed. I want you to understand what I did with that laughter, because it's the only reason I'm telling you this story. I stood up from the folding chair. I walked the length of that ballroom in dead silence, my heels the only sound on the parquet floor. And when I reached the head table, I reached into my bag and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper, a deed, signed that morning, notarized, recorded with the county before I ever drove to that party. I set it on the white tablecloth, in front of my father, and then, in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress, I told him what I had done with the one thing he had spent his entire life wanting and never been able to afford. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories. If you've ever spent years trying to earn a place that should have been yours from the start, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay until the end, because sometimes the sweetest payback is finally knowing your worth. I was 5 years old when Carl and Margaret Whitcomb brought me home from the Hartley County Children's Services office in a Bic that smelled like vinyl and cigarettes. Carl had quit 2 years earlier, but the car hadn't forgotten. I don't remember much from before that car ride. I remember Margaret's hands, soft and cool, holding mine in both of hers the whole way home, like she was afraid I might slip out the window if she let go. For a while, it was good. I want to say that clearly, because the easy version of this story paints everyone in black from the start, and that isn't true, and it isn't fair, and Margaret deserves better than the easy version, even now. She bought me a yellow coat that first winter. She took me to the garden club luncheons and let the other women admire me, and they did. They cooed over my hair, my manners, the careful way I said thank you for everything, because I had already learned, even at 5, that gratitude was the price of staying somewhere. "What a gift you're getting," the women would say to Margaret, and she would smile and squeeze my shoulder, and I understood, slowly, the way children understand things without being told, that I was not exactly a daughter. I was a gift, a good deed with a ponytail, proof of something Margaret needed to prove about herself. She had wanted a baby for 9 years before they adopted me. 3 rounds of treatments that didn't take, a specialist in Cleveland who finally told her, gently, that it likely wasn't going to happen. Margaret didn't adopt a daughter so much as adopt a story about her own goodness, a story she could tell at the country club, at church, at every dinner party for the rest of her life. I understand that now, the way you understand things only after you've stopped needing the person to be better than they were. For 3 years, I was happy to be the proof. Being admired felt close enough to being loved that a small child couldn't tell the difference. I can tell the difference now. Carl was different, harder to read, because Carl mostly wasn't there. He ran an insurance brokerage in town, golfed on Saturdays, came home tired most evenings with his tie already loosened in the car. His version of fatherhood was paying for things and being thanked for it. He signed the school forms. He never asked what the forms were for. Then, when I was 8, Margaret got pregnant. The doctors in Cleveland had called it essentially impossible. And then it wasn't. My brother Theodore was born in April, with Carl's jaw and Margaret's pale eyes and a blanket monogrammed before he had a name. I loved him at first. I was 8, and he was small, and I genuinely believed, the way only an 8-year-old can believe something so completely wrong, that a brother was the thing that would finally make me belong for real. Something shifted in that house instead. Slow at first, the way a season turns, you don't notice the exact day the leaves start changing. You just look up one afternoon and the light is different. The photographs changed first. The new ones had 3 people in them, and I'd find myself standing just outside the frame, holding someone's coat, asked to take take the picture, instead of being in it. Then the seating changed. Sunday dinners had 5 matching chairs around the table, and one folding chair that lived folded against the wall of the hall closet, brought out and set at the corner near the kitchen door whenever I was there. Nobody announced it. Margaret just set it out one evening, the way you'd set out an extra placemat, and when I reached for one of the real chairs, she put her hand on my shoulder, gentle as anything, and said in front of everyone, "You'll take the folding chair, sweetheart. We're a little tight on seats tonight." I was 8. I took the folding chair. I took it for the next 30 years. Every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday dinner where Theodore got the chair with the good cushion, and I got the cold metal one that left a pattern pressed into the backs of my knees. I told myself it didn't mean anything. A chair is just a chair, I'd think, the way a single sheet of paper is just paper, until the day it isn't. Carl was harder to map than Margaret, because his cruelty wasn't active. It was absence dressed up as business. With Theodore, he showed up, little league games, the father-son fishing trips, the careful, warm voice he used when Theodore needed something explained. With me, he wrote checks and called it parenting. I learned the actual shape of things on a Tuesday night, when I was 11, sneaking downstairs for a glass of water. Carl and his brother Hal were in the den, with the basketball game on low, voices loose with 2 beers each, and I heard my name through the half-open door, so I stopped in the dark hallway the way children do. Hal had asked Carl something about college funds, whether they'd set anything aside for me the way they had for Theodore. Carl laughed, not cruelly, carelessly, the way you'd talk about a piece of furniture someone left you that you hadn't gotten around to dealing with. "She's Margaret's project," he said, "not really mine." The game came back up on the television. That was the end of it for him. For me, it was the beginning of something I'd carry for 27 years. I didn't cry, which surprised me even then. I just understood something and filed it away the way I would later file invoices and contracts and the names of people who did exactly what they said they would do. "She's Margaret's project, not really mine." I carried that sentence through every folding chair and every photograph I took instead of stood in. There was a phrase Carl used at nearly every family gathering for the rest of my childhood, a thing he wanted so badly it had become almost a tic. There was a stone house on Andis Lake at the edge of town, 3 stories, a wraparound porch, a boathouse with its own dock, the kind of property the men at Carl's country club measured themselves against. Carl would drive us past it on Sunday afternoons, slow, so we could all get a good look. "When my ship comes in," he'd say, "eyes on the lake through the windshield, we'll have that place." He said it for 30 years. His ship never came in. Carl sold insurance, competently, but not spectacularly, and the math never once worked in his favor. I used to hear that sentence and think wanting something hard enough was the same as deserving it. It took me years on my own, building something with my own 2 hands, to understand that those are not the same thing at all. At 18, the support ended the way a faucet shuts off, all at once, no ceremony. Theodore was 10 by then, getting a tutor for math and a summer trip to a leadership camp in Colorado. I got a graduation card with $60 in it and a line from Margaret about how independent I'd always been, how I'd land on my feet, how I always did. It wasn't a kindness, it was a discharge. I packed what fit into 2 duffel bags and left Hartley County. And here is where the story stops being only sad, because I refused to make myself pathetic for anyone, including the people who might have wanted me to. I worked retail for 2 years to cover community college, then transferred into a state university's business program on loans and a partial scholarship I'd fought for. I waited tables through every semester. I learned, slowly and without anyone teaching me on purpose, that I liked building things, spreadsheets, systems, small businesses that solved real problems for real people. I liked that the work didn't care whether anyone in my family noticed it. I started Whitcomb Logistics, and yes, I kept the name, which I'll explain in a moment, because it matters, at 26, with a single delivery van and a contract with one mid-sized furniture retailer who needed last-mile delivery handled better than their current vendor was handling it. I solved their problem. They told 2 other retailers. By 28, I had 4 vans and a warehouse lease. By 32, I had built a regional logistics company with 81 employees and contracts with companies whose names you'd recognize. I kept the Whitcomb name, even after everything, because changing it would have meant giving Carl and Margaret credit for the decision to walk away, and I wasn't going to give them that. The name was mine before it was theirs. It would stay mine after. And here is the part I'm not proud of. With every good year, I sent the Whitcombs something. A holiday basket, a check toward Theodore's car, a new furnace for the house. The one winter Carl mentioned twice that theirs had started making a knocking sound. I told myself I was being gracious. The truth is uglier and quieter than that. I had spent my whole life trying to buy a seat at a table that was never going to be mine, and money was just the grown-up version of taking the folding chair, without complaint. I was generous the way some people are generous, hoping that if I gave enough, eventually, someone would turn and say, "Sit here with us, you belong." Nobody ever did. I just kept building, kept giving, kept working past midnight in an office I owned outright, while the people I was trying to reach didn't notice and didn't ask. I didn't see the full pattern then. I would see it all at once, eventually, in a single screenshot I was never supposed to read. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday in April. Heavy cream stock, gold foil lettering, a country club address in Hartley Hollow, the town where I'd learned to make myself small enough to fit a folding chair. The Whitcomb family cordially invites you to celebrate Carl's 70th birthday. My old name was written across the front in Margaret's careful hand. Eleanor Whitcomb, not Eleanor Whitcomb Hale, the name on my logistics contracts, the name on 81 paychecks every 2 weeks. Just Eleanor Whitcomb, the way I'd been labeled since I was 5, a category instead of a person. I read it twice, then I set it face down on my desk, the way you set down something hot, and went back to a vendor contract I was reviewing for a new regional account. The contract made sense. The invitation did not. It sat there all morning, and I felt it the way you feel a draft from a door you thought was shut. I called my cousin by marriage, Brenda, Carl's younger sister-in-law, technically not blood to me at all, but the one person in that family who had ever treated me like a person instead of a project. She used to slip me the good cookies when I was small and ask, quietly, what I actually thought about things, which nobody else in that house had ever bothered to ask. "They really do want you there, Elle," Brenda said. "Carl's turning 70. People mellow. Maybe it's a chance." I sat with that. Maybe it was a chance. I am a sharp woman in nearly every room I walk into, but families have a way of making you stupid in one very specific spot, because the 8-year-old in the folding chair never fully leaves. She just waits in the back of your chest for someone to crack the door. I told Brenda I'd think about it, but I had already started thinking about it the wrong way, the old way, the giving way. I was thinking, what could I bring that would finally be enough? Lying awake that night, an idea arrived that should have frightened me and instead felt, terribly, like relief. The house on Andis Lake, the one Carl had driven us past for 30 years, the one he'd never been able to afford. I could give him the one thing he had wanted his entire life. If I handed him the deed in front of everyone at his 70th birthday, the sentence I'd carried since I was 11, "She's Margaret's project, not really mine," would simply cease to be true. He would have to claim me, in front of the whole club, with the boathouse practically thrown in. I dressed that plan up as generosity, and called Brenda back to say I'd come. She cried a little, she was so happy. I told myself her happiness proved I was doing the right thing. I want to be honest about why I started making calls about that property the very next morning, because the easy version makes me look better than I was. The easy version says I went to make peace. The real version says I went to win, not loudly, but the way I win at everything, by being so undeniably, overwhelmingly good that the verdict about who I was would finally have to change. The house was for sale. The previous owner, a widower who'd held it for 4 decades, had passed that winter, and his children, scattered across 3 states and uninterested in a stone house on a Midwestern lake, had listed it quietly that spring. $4 million, give or take, for the house, the boathouse, and the longest stretch of private shoreline on Andis Lake. I drove out to see it on a grey Thursday. I stood on the dock where Carl had always wanted to stand, where he'd pointed and said, "When my ship comes in for 30 straight years, I could afford it without losing sleep over the number," and that fact sat strangely in my chest. The daughter who took the folding chair, standing on the shoreline, her father had coveted his entire adult life. I told the agent I wanted it. The papers started moving, and the closer they got to signing, the more a small, quiet voice asked me a question foundation, I kept refusing to hear. I'd routed the purchase through a foundation, not to hide anything, but because that's how you move real estate of that size cleanly, and because 3 years earlier I'd quietly set up the Open Door initiative after one of my drivers, a young man named Marcus, who'd aged out of the foster system at 18 with 2 trash bags and nowhere to go, mentioned it to me once in passing, almost embarrassed, like it was something he shouldn't have said out loud. I knew that math. I'd lived a softer version of it myself. The foundation had funded a handful of small scholarships and not much else. A good intention, with a bank account, waiting for me to decide what it was really for. So the purchase ran through Open Door, and my attorney drew up a grant deed transferring the property out of the foundation and into the names of Carl and Margaret Whitcomb. Free and clear. A gift with no strings, the kind of thing that doesn't actually happen to people like Carl. I held the draft of that deed at my kitchen table on a Sunday night. 1 sheet of heavy stock paper, a notary block at the bottom, 2 blank lines for the grantees. Carl Whitcomb, Margaret Whitcomb. I read their names where my lawyer had typed them, and I waited to feel the warm thing I'd been chasing my whole life, the thing I had been about to spend $4 million to feel in advance. I didn't feel it. I felt the folding chair against the backs of my knees. I felt 11 years old in a dark hallway, listening to a basketball game, and a sentence I never asked to hear. I called Brenda the next morning, before I could do anything rash. We met at a diner halfway between our towns. I told her some of it, not the price, not the foundation, just that I'd found a way to give Carl something enormous, and that I wasn't sure anymore why I wanted to. Brenda stirred her coffee for a long moment. Can I ask you something hard, kiddo? Go ahead. When you picture handing it to him, what are you hoping he'll do? I opened my mouth to say something noble. What came out instead was the truth. I'm hoping he'll finally say I'm his. Brenda nodded slowly, like she'd been waiting 20 years for me to say it out loud. He won't, she said, not unkindly, just certain, the certainty of a woman who'd watched her brother-in-law refuse to grow for 6 decades. Carl is who Carl is. A lake house won't fix that. It'll just give him a bigger thing to fail to deserve. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Not everybody who shares his last name is him, Elle. You know that, right? I didn't entirely know that yet, but I was starting to. I drove home that night with the unsigned deed still in my bag and a different idea forming, slow and cold and clear. I just needed one more piece of proof before I let myself believe it. The proof arrived 4 days later, on a Saturday morning, in the form of a phone call from Brenda, whose voice was wrong, careful and furious at the same time. They added me to the family group chat by mistake, she said. I'm going to send you something, and I'm sorry, and I almost didn't, but you deserve to see what you're walking into. The screenshot came through. I read it standing at my kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me, and I read it 3 times the way I'd read the invitation, except this time nothing in me wanted to look away. Theodore first, is the charity case actually coming to this thing? LOL. Margaret, be nice. She's good for the photos. Looks generous in front of the club. Theodore again, she's not in the will, right? Then Carl, my father, the man whose name I'd had my lawyer type onto a $4 million deed. Don't worry, I'll make it official Saturday night. Everyone will know exactly where things stand. I set the phone down very gently, because I have learned over many years that the angriest thing you can do is be careful. So that was the toast Theodore had apparently been smirking about for weeks. That was the joke I wasn't in on. They weren't inviting their daughter to a birthday party. They were inviting a prop, a generous-looking prop to stand in the background of the photographs, and then be formally, publicly written out loud for entertainment, with cake. I thought I would feel my heart break. Instead, I felt it go quiet, the specific quiet I feel right before I solve a logistics problem nobody else has been able to untangle. The quiet of something finally showing me its true shape. I looked at the unsigned deed sitting in my bag by the door, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. Here is the thing I understood standing in my kitchen, with that screenshot glowing on the counter. For 30 years, I had been trying to win an argument with people who were never going to award me the point. I had built my case in checks and furnaces and now, nearly, in a $4 million lake house, and they had been laughing about it in a group chat the whole time. You cannot earn your way into a room that has already decided you're the help. You can only stop knocking. So I didn't cancel. I didn't call and scream, which is what they would have understood, what they were braced for if anything went wrong. I sat down at my kitchen table and called my attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Renata Cole, at home on a Saturday. I want to change the grantee on the deed, I told her. Take Carl and Margaret off entirely. There will be no names of theirs on anything of mine, ever again. I told her the property would go where it should have gone from the start. Somewhere it would actually mean something. Somewhere a sheet of paper could open a real door instead of closing one. Transfer the lake property to the Open Door Initiative, I said. Permanently, irrevocably, to be converted into transitional housing for kids who age out of foster care with 2 trash bags and nowhere to go. Kids like Marcus, kids like I nearly was, if Margaret hadn't needed a story to tell at the garden club. Renata asked if I was sure. I told her I had never been more certain of anything in my life. I didn't go looking for a name, I told her, though she didn't fully understand what I meant yet. I went looking to give one away. She drew up the new deed that afternoon. We would sign and record it first thing Saturday morning, before the party, before the toast, before Carl ever lifted a glass. We met the notary at 8:30 that morning, a calm, unhurried woman named Patricia, who had no idea she was witnessing the end of something 30 years in the making. I signed the grant deed transferring the lake property to the Open Door Initiative. Patricia notarized it. By 9, Renata had recorded it electronically with the County Register of Deeds, and the moment the confirmation number came back on her phone, it was done, finished, carved into public record where no apology and no birthday toast could ever undo it. The house belonged to the kids now. Then I did one more thing. I had Renata print me a single copy of the recorded deed, one sheet of paper, the grantee line reading the Open Door Initiative in plain black type, and I folded it once and slid it into my bag. The real one was already filed. This was just the version I was going to bring to the party. The version I was going to set on a white tablecloth in front of Carl Whitcomb while 90 people watched. I want to pause here because I think some of you are carrying an invitation like mine right now, an invitation to a room that never saved you a real seat. You do not owe anyone your smallness. You do not have to buy your way into a love that keeps the receipt. If that lands for you, stay with me, because what happens at that party is the entire reason I sat down to tell you this. The Hartley Hollow Country Club had a ballroom with windows the height of a house and a lawn that ran down toward a smaller lake than the one Carl had always wanted. On the evening of his 70th, it was full of every person he had spent his life trying to impress. Colleagues gone grey and prosperous, golfing partners, and their wives in good jewelry, neighbors who'd watched the Whitcomb Bick crawl past Andus Lake on Sunday afternoons for 3 decades. There was a banner, gold on white, 70 and still going strong. There was a cake the size of a card table, 70 candles waiting to be lit near a long head table set with white linen, gold-bound chairs, and place cards in copper ink. I found my seat before Margaret had to point me to it. At the far end, near the swinging kitchen doors, past the good flatware, sat a single folding chair. No bow. A small tented place card in front of it that read, simply, Eleanor. No last name, the way they'd quietly erased it for 30 years. I looked at it. I looked at the swinging doors behind it, where the staff came and went carrying other people's dinners. And I smiled at Margaret when she caught me looking, a real smile, because I knew something she didn't. I was never going to sit in it. I spent the next hour being a guest at a party thrown to humiliate me, holding a glass of champagne I never drank, with a calm that surprised even me. Theodore found me by the windows at one point and asked, with the particular cruelty of a man who insults you and calls it teasing, what exactly it was I did again. Logistics, I said. Trucking, mostly. He laughed at his own private joke and didn't ask anything else. Across the room, Carl tapped a fork against his glass. The room hushed and turned. He stood at the head table with a microphone in one hand, 70 years old and lit up with the kind of attention he'd been collecting his whole life. He thanked everyone for coming. He made a joke about his knees. He told the story of building his agency from nothing, which made me bite the inside of my cheek, because Carl had inherited that agency from his own father and had never built anything from nothing in his life. He raised a glass to Theodore, my son, my legacy, and the room applauded, and Margaret dabbed at her eyes. I stood near my folding chair, holding my untouched champagne, and felt the speech bending toward me the way weather bends toward a coast. Theodore was grinning into his wine. Margaret had arranged her face into something expectant and pleased. Brenda, across the room, had gone pale and still, the only other person who knew what was waiting. Carl found me at the edge of the room. Something flickered behind his glasses, anticipation, the look of a man about to deliver a line he'd been polishing for weeks. He smiled. He lifted his glass another inch. I'll tell you all something funny, he said into the microphone. I'm not going to make you wait for it. You already heard it at the very start of this story. No hard feelings, sweetheart. You were never really ours. We just never got around to crossing you off. 90 people laughed. The loud, relieved laugh of people who've decided something is permitted. I set my champagne down on the nearest table, not slammed, just set down, the way you set down a tool you're finished with. Then I reached over and picked up the folding chair. My folding chair, the metal one with the place card that said only Eleanor. I carried it 3 steps and leaned it folded against the wall, out of the way you put away a thing you will never need again. I straightened my jacket. I walked toward the head table, unhurried, my heels the only sound on the parquet, and the room went from laughing to silent in the time it took me to cross it. Carl's smile was still half up, the microphone still in his hand, his eyes following me with the first thread of uncertainty. Margaret half rose from her chair. Theodore said, "Elle, it's a joke, sit down," and his voice cracked on the last word, because there was no chair left to sit down in. I'd seen to that. I reached the head table. I reached into my bag. And I want you to stay with me here, because what I put on that table is the whole reason I'm telling you this story. I took out a single sheet of paper, folded once, and I smoothed it flat on the white tablecloth in front of Carl Whitcomb, in front of everyone, and the entire room leaned in to see what it was. "Happy birthday, Carl," I said. My voice came out even and quiet, and in that silent room, it carried better than his microphone had. "I brought you a gift. I've been planning it for weeks. I want everyone here to know what it was, because you all just heard what you think I am, and now you're going to hear the rest." I touched the folded edge of the paper. 3 weeks ago, I bought the house on Anders Lake. The name moved through the room like a current. Half of them had watched Carl covet that house for 30 years. The stone house, the boat house, the dock you used to point at every Sunday and say, "When my ship comes in." I bought it in cash. I had a deed drawn up. I looked at him, and I kept my voice as gentle as Margaret's had ever been the night she handed me that first folding chair. "I was going to give it to you tonight. Put both your names on it. Hand you the one thing you wanted your whole life, in front of everyone, as a present." Someone at a back table whispered a number. Carl was staring at the paper like it might move. His hand twitched toward it, and in the deepest quiet that ballroom had held all night, I said the line I'd carried in from the parking lot. But I didn't come for a name. I came to give one away. Then, while every person in that ballroom watched, I picked the deed back up off the tablecloth and tore it in half. The sound of it was enormous in the silence. A single clean rip. I folded the halves together and tore again, calm and unhurried, until the paper was a small drift of pieces in my hand. I opened my fingers and let them fall across the white linen, scattered between his cake and his reading glasses. "That was a copy," I said. "I want to be very clear, because I know how this family handles inconvenient truths. The original was signed at 8:30 this morning, notarized, recorded with the county at 9, before I ever drove here. It's done. It's filed. It is permanent public record, and it cannot be undone by anyone in this room, including me." I let that sit. "The lake house doesn't belong to you, Carl," I said quietly. "It never will. As of this morning, it belongs to the Open Door Initiative, and it's being turned into a home. A real one, for kids who age out of foster care, at 18 with 2 garbage bags and nowhere to sleep." I held his eyes. "Kids like the one you took in for the photographs, and then left in a folding chair for 30 years. They get the lake house, they get the boat house and the shoreline and the someday, and you get to read about it in the paper." Carl did the thing I will remember for the rest of my life. He reached out with both hands, this 70-year-old man in his good suit, and began gathering the torn pieces of the deed off the tablecloth, clumsy and urgent, his reading glasses sliding down his nose, fitting torn edges back together right there on the linen in front of his guests. Nobody helped him. Nobody spoke. He worked the scraps with shaking fingers, and as the words reassembled under his hands, I watched him read them. Grant deed, Anders Lake, and on the line where he had expected, somewhere in his chest, to someday see his own name, the typed black letters, the Open Door Initiative. He read it twice. The color went out of his face from the forehead down, the ruddy golf course, tan draining away, until he was gray as a February sky. Then the room came apart, and it came apart exactly the way you'd expect, with everyone showing the room who they really were. Margaret rose first, the tears arriving on cue, the practice kind, and she turned to her guests, not to me, always to the audience. After everything we did for her, she said, we gave her a home. We gave her everything. And this is the cruelty she repays us with, in public, on your father's birthday. Theodore was worse, because Theodore didn't even pretend it was about feelings. You can't just give away a $4 million house, he said, too loud. That's insane. That should have. He actually said it. The will not yet read, the man not yet gone, already grieving money that was never going to be his. Carl never stood up. He sat at the head of his own party, with the torn deed assembled under his grey hands, and looked up at me, and for one moment, something real broke through, something underneath 70 years of performance. A flicker of grief, so genuine it almost undid me. Eleanor, he said, just my name. Horse, his eyes wet, his hand lifting an inch off the table toward me. For 1 second, I thought he might say the true thing, might break the right way. Margaret said his name sharply, a command, and he heard it, and his hand came back down, and he looked away. He chose her. He always had. I stayed perfectly calm. There was nothing left to say at volume. I picked up my bag, buttoned my jacket, and looked at the three of them one last time. Margaret performing her wound, Theodore doing math, Carl staring at the tablecloth. I spent my whole life trying to get you to claim me, I said quietly to Carl. Buying it, earning it, almost bringing you a lake. And tonight you stood up in front of all your friends, and told me who I am to you. I picked one torn scrap off the tablecloth, just one, and closed it in my hand. So I'm going to believe you. You can keep the pieces. I already kept the part that mattered. I turned and walked the length of that silent ballroom toward the tall windows and the doors beyond them, and the only sound was my heels on the parquet again, 90 people parting to let me through. Brenda was waiting near the doors, eyes wet, and she put a steady hand on my arm. Atta girl, kiddo, she whispered. I walked out into a cool June evening, and didn't look back once. The folding chair stayed folded against the wall where I'd left it. I have never sat in one since. The fallout was quiet and complete, the way the best kind always is. The deed could not be reversed, because there was nothing to reverse. The property belonged to the foundation lawfully, permanently, and no one at that table had any standing to contest a gift that had never been given to them in the first place. Theodore talked to a lawyer of his own that week, I heard, and the lawyer told him what mine had already known. You cannot sue your way into a gift that was never made. The local paper ran a warm piece 2 weeks later about a self-made logistics entrepreneur donating a historic lakefront estate to house foster youth. It did not mention the Whitcombs at all, which I think wounded them more than any accusation could have. I never spoke to Carl or Margaret again, not out of hatred. I simply had nothing left I needed from them. A boundary, it turns out, is just the absence of a door you use to keep knocking on. We finished the renovations the following spring, almost a year to the day after the previous owner had passed. We made it as efficient and warm as I knew how to make it, because those kids deserved a house that didn't cost a fortune to keep heated through a Midwestern winter. 8 bedrooms, a real kitchen, a counselor's office, a long wooden dining table I had built myself, on weekends, sanding it down by hand in my own garage, because some things you don't outsource. The first residents moved in the week we opened, 6 of them, teenagers who had aged out with nothing, the way I nearly had, the way Marcus had. There were 7 chairs at the table I'd built, all of them matching, all of them good. A girl named Tasha, 18 and freshly aged out that month, hung back by the kitchen door the way I used to, waiting to be told where the lesser seat was, already certain there had to be one. I knew that posture. I had invented that posture. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the best one, the one with the clearest view of the water, and I looked at her. This one's yours, I said. She didn't believe me at first. They never do. Then she sat down at the head of the table, in a house on a lake that a man had wanted his whole life, and never deserved, and she looked out at the water that belonged to her now, and she smiled like she'd been let in from the cold. There is not a folding chair anywhere in that building. There never will be. I spent 30 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was